All right, we'll give this a second. Looks like it's working. Looks like our bits are good. I'm almost ready to hit play on that. All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, we'll just start this right away. Today, we're going to finish The Prince, and, finish is a broad word, but for those of you who read it, right, Machiavelli's Prince is not that long, and I would argue it's a pretty easy read. Probably the hardest part, if you have no basis in either Renaissance Italy or the ancient world, that part can be incomprehensible a little bit. But again, that's one reason I recommended this version of the book. If you look at the notes, right, the notes actually explain who and what everything is. So even if you didn't know the history, you could work your way through it. And, I'm cheating, being a ancient classics scholar from my first degree being from Europe. I already know who everybody is. So as necessary, I'll explain, or if you have questions, I actually know who these people are. So I'll do my best to help out. And then we'll probably start Sun Tzu. My dream would be the first couple chapters. Now, if you did not look at Sun Tzu yet, I don't know what you're doing, because it's really quite... it's a deep read, but it's not a hard read. And one reason I really like that... I get my doc cam working. For next week, I'll work on it. One reason I don't actually like this translator very much as a person, what's his name, John Minford, I don't really like him, but I do like that he kept the original format that the Chinese had. It's a very interesting way to read it. So we'll get into that too when we get to Sun Tzu, but it's not a hard read. It might be easier than The Prince, lengthwise, although it's probably harder, meaning-wise, but we'll get into that. So that's what we're doing today, everybody. Welcome. Alright, let's jump on in where we left off. Let me get my PowerPoint up. Here we go. Okay. Alright, so when we left... Uh-oh. Did I delete it by accident? Oh, no. I did. Oh, man. I accidentally deleted where we left off, so I'll have to bring it back in. Okay, so where we left off was... I'll just get it from last class. We did ecclesiastical principalities, and then we were supposed to go to military organization and mercenary troops, which was on the slide before this, so I'm just going to cheat and copy-paste. 1 second. I have everything saved, so it'll work out just fine. Let's get that slide. Where are you, my slide? How did I manage to delete you? Here we go. Wait, what? Okay, maybe I'm just blind. Hold on. No, it is here. Man, my brain. It is one of those days. Okay, let's look at it again. Ah, yeah, there it is. Good. So, okay. So, we stopped around here last time, I'm pretty sure. If somebody thinks I'm going too far, let me know. But the goal last class, I wanted to get to 12. So, we didn't quite get that far. Did we get this far, everybody? Can somebody check me? I think we did. Let's see, any posting. Somebody's already asking what book do we have to read next. As I said, Sun Tzu. And again, Sun Tzu's not that hard. Alright, so we're going to get now, starting today, into military organization and mercenary troops. So, again, this one can feel... My notes say 8. Somebody said we got to 8. Oh, maybe that's why I did the whole slide then. So that means our last one was coming to power by crime. Oh, yeah. Okay, so we didn't do constitutional principality, how strength is measured, etc. Alright, that'll work. That's why I kept the whole slide then. Man, early morning me knows what he's doing. Alright. So 8, the one that I don't actually have 8 on here, but we have 9. 8 was just coming to power by crime. And, again, it's all about how you execute it. It can work out. So let's go to the constitutional principality. Here we go. Yeah, we left off at 8. Good. Thank you for somebody for checking me. My brain and reality don't always match. Alright, so going back a little bit. The constitutional principality. Now this, what is this? Well, it's when we come to rule through the favor of the citizens. A.k.a. you're picked to rule. So, that sounds great, right? Don't we like that? Like, we live in technically a republic or a democracy, depending on your mood. But, in a way, it is kind of a constitutional principality. Why would I say that? We basically have a Caesar. Now, you might not like that. You might not know what a Caesar is. But what's a Caesar? Caesar's what the Romans would pick to rule them. And you'd reserve for a year. But there was 2 of them, but they basically had absolute power. That's how the Romans got around it being too corrupt for a while. We technically have kind of a prince, right? Like, the President of the United States can invade anywhere in the world. Well, it used to be for 2 days. Now he can kind of invade anywhere in the world. He just has to use a little bit of we'll call it relativistic lies and say like, oh, it's an aggressive police action. You're like, oh, now it's okay. My goodness, people. And this is interesting too. He talks about what it can bring. Where's this quote I got here? So the problem with being elected, so this is, he mentions here, a constitutional principality is either created by the nobles or the people. And he mentions just how it happens naturally, right? So either the people are trying to protect themselves from the nobles, or the nobles trying to raise up one of their own. He mentions here a man who becomes prince by favor of the people finds himself standing alone, and he has near to him neither no one or very few not prepared to take orders. In addition, it is impossible to satisfy the nobles honorably without doing violence to the interests of others. But this can be done as far as the people are concerned. And quote, this is a great quote here, this is on 33. The people are more honest in their intentions than the nobles are, because the latter want to oppress the people, whereas they want only not to be oppressed, aka the people. So, we then get to the consequences here. What does this turn out to? And he always gives great examples. Where is this one? Oh man, we're going to come to the Gracchis later. But he mentions principalities usually come to grief when the transition is made from a limited power to absolutism. Princes taking this step will either directly or through magistrates, and he's Machiavelli, gives a Machiavelli level of detail. But then the result, you'll either have a free city, a principality, or anarchy. There's not another choice. So when you have an elected monarchy, because either the city will become free because it manages to keep its constitution, it'll go full principality, or the people versus the nobles will just fall into anarchy. And again, which one's the worst choice? Obviously anarchy is the worst, right? The other two are not, strictly speaking, bad in Machiavellian terms. And in terms of this book, you could argue Principality was the best. Alright, so now how strength is measured. I like this one. Now we talk about strength. Straight up, this only means military strength. Now, he talks about this. This is on 36, I'm looking here. So the question here is to see whether he can stand alone or whether he must have recourse to the protection of others. To clarify further, I say that in my judgment, those princes that can stand alone, who have sufficient manpower or money to assemble an army equal to the encounter of any aggressor, in the same way those princes must always have recourse to others who cannot take the field against the enemy, but are forced to retreat behind walls and make their defense there. So this is an important point. There's really only two groups of places. You can call them kingdoms or states or countries or whatever. There's only two kinds. The kind that can defend itself by itself, and the kind that must rely on others for defense. Now, Machiavelli does not actually go as far as I'd like into this. Now, we'll use this metric a lot as we go through this semester. Why? Well, this is where you can say it's not an opinion of Machiavelli, it's an observation of reality. Because if you can defend yourself, politically speaking, or international politics, right, you have more options of like what you can do. But if you must rely on defense of another country, you must do what that country wants. So you basically lose your agency as a principality or a nation if you rely on the defense of someone else. Why would that be relevant? Very common in the colonial and post-colonial age, needing other countries to defend oneself. All right, now we get into ecclesiastical. This strictly means places held by the church. And in Machiavelli's time, the church was still a major landowner in Europe. Interestingly enough, a big part of the Enlightenment, Renaissance, Protestant narrative that is used to attack the Catholic Church is that it controlled like a third of Europe. And then after the Reformation, they controlled less. And then back, the Catholics will say that, the Reformation was only intended just as land theft. But the interesting reality of this is, actually the ecclesiastical land holdings are still some of the biggest in the world. What I mean is, the Catholic, all the major denominations, but especially Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, own a lot of land. I think the Pope is the biggest landholder in the world, or the papacy, more correctly. And he only mentions this because in his time there wasn't Protestants yet. Church land could basically ignore all of Machiavelli's rules in his time period, especially Catholic countries, because you couldn't do anything. right? They had all of the, like, we'll call it soft power, right? They basically excommunicate you. Now, this authority, you could argue, a Protestant would call it corruption, right? The fact that a church land doesn't have to be well managed, it doesn't have to protect itself, and let's just say there's a reckoning after Machiavelli. Within the 100 years after Machiavelli, this one is kind of, we'll say, settled, or at least made much more, conflicted. But his basic point is, church land doesn't, and none of these rules apply to church land because the church has power that's not physical power. That's basically his point. And I didn't even have a subheading on here. So now we're to where I thought we were starting. Military organization and mercenary troops. This one is great. So he gets into, like he said, okay, so for principalities, free to act if it can protect itself, right? Or more correctly, if it's strong, if it can stand on its own feet. We have to talk about what consists of that strength. So he gets into mercenary troops, and basically why mercenaries are bad. Let me read a little bit of this, and I'll give you some of the history after we read it, although he does a pretty good job of this too. He says, "Now I say the arms which the prince bases the defense of his state are either one his own, or mercenaries, or auxiliary, or composite." That means a mix of those. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. He'll argue why in a minute. If a prince bases his defense of state on mercenaries, he will achieve neither stability nor security. For mercenaries are disunited, thirsty for power, undisciplined, and disloyal. They are brave among their friends and cowards before their enemy. They have no fear of God. They do not keep faith with their fellow man. They avoid defeat just so long as they avoid battle. In peacetime you are despoiled by them, and in wartime by the enemy. The reason for all this is there is no loyalty or inducement to keep the field apart from the little they are paid, and it's not enough to make them want to die for you. So here's the problem with mercenaries, right? Fundamentally, you're not paying them enough to die. That's it. And it doesn't help, man. Like, so you're not paying them enough to die. Yeah, somebody says, geez, begging on mercs. Yes, but that's the problem, right? They don't fight. So when you're not fighting, they're expensive. And then as soon as you start fighting, they're not paid enough. They're just not very useful. And then this whole section, he goes into a bunch of examples. And he goes in positive and negative, right? So, and then he mentions this. Then you get into even deeper problems, right? Like, even if the mercenaries are skilled, now if you have a skilled mercenary, he just wants to be the prince. And then he gives examples of the biggest two we'll call counterexamples before modern times. This is 41. He says, Roman Sparta endured for many centuries, armed and free. The Swiss are strongly armed and completely free. The Carthaginians provide an example of reliance on mercenary armies in ancient times. They were nearly subjugated by their mercenary troops. After the first war with the Romans is over. And then even though they held the command, they almost got totally overthrown. And then he gives a bunch of Italian examples. So basically, he says it here with the Venetian example, right? Venice. He mentions that even if you managed to conquer, like the Venetians conquered one of their neighbors, and then the mercenary captain was so skilled, they couldn't get rid of him, so they killed him, and then they could barely hold on to what they had, and the first real player showed up, they collapsed. Somebody says, too, thinking in terms of games, it makes even more sense. Yeah, so this is based in history, too. And he mentions what's the best for a republic or a prince. And remember, he almost doesn't mention republics, but he does. He has a book on them. We'll talk about them more. As we go through the semester, I'll bring in more and more of his discourses. And if you're interested, you could read it. I might even upload some chapters. For republic or a prince, right, either form of government, your own troops are best, right? So basically, your troops will fight better and more. Let me find the quote here. We already had the Roman quote, but... And I'll get into it a little later. But the point he does make here, he has a full point later, but basically your own troops are always best because they're fighting for themselves, right? You're fighting for your city, your time. It's not about pay. And when your own troops, he does in fact mean free citizen troops. Anything else in a Machiavellian conception is a mercenary. So people need to have a tie to a place to fight well for the place. But if they fight well for that place, suddenly you have strength, then you can defend yourself. And if you don't know anything about Europe, the Swiss example, the Swiss broke away from the German Empire man, probably 1,000 years ago. And then they've maintained a fully armed, fully fighting population for the last 1,000 years, and they managed to avoid 1,000 years of wars, basically, which is nice. Let's see. I'll go here, but somebody has a question. Why are we invading to preserve democracy? Yeah, don't even... We'll talk about that as we go forward in history, about, how can you say it, invading for ideological reasons. Oof. That's all I'm going to say. Oof. Yeah. It didn't work. Spoiler. It's almost like democracy requires, let's be honest, any kind of Republican and representative government requires a long history of bloodshed to make it, to work your way towards it. All right, and I'll check for other questions too. A sense of nationality. The worst part with the word nationality is it's been kind of dirtied. It's a much more sense of community and placeness, right, and association, right? If you're tied to a place or people, you're much more likely to fight for that place or people. People ask, are mercs still used today? Yes. Literally, the international community tries to pretend they're illegal, and then everybody uses them. What I mean is, even just talking about the United States military, for example, parts of it could be considered mercenary. Why? There's people who join for the money who aren't Americans and fight for America. That's literally the definition of a mercenary, right? But also, there's stuff like PMCs, right, private military contractors, which are civilians you pay to fight. But so, for me, I'd say, from a Machiavellian sense, Machiavelli would say, it doesn't matter if, they're technically military or technically a company. The idea is, if you're fighting for your own nation, you're not a mercenary. And if you're fighting for somebody else's nation, you are a mercenary. And we'll get into the second group that's not exactly mercenaries, but it's like them. And somebody says that all mercenaries are also more prone to steal from they work for. Yeah, well, they're more prone to just steal wherever you're garrisoning them, right? Like, if they're in your own land, they'll rob you. But if your own land is their home, why would people rob their home? And think about this book, right? He spends a lot of time talking about harm of, the thing people remember forever is harming your property, right? If I'm in my city, I can't harm other people's property because they know who I am, right? They can find my family and my property and get me back. So there's more of that reciprocity too. All right. Now we get into the other kinds of troops. So auxiliary, composite, and native troops. Now the most interesting here, before we get into the other ones, is auxiliary troops. These are almost as horrible for him, and these are other powerful states' support troops. So he gives lots of examples like France or Spain, because they're like, hey, you want some help? We'll send you a full set of soldiers to help you out of the goodwill of our hearts. 45, he has some examples. He says here, he gives a couple examples. The Florentines ask the French to come, and they don't leave. The Emperor of Constantinople asked the Turks for help. They never left. He says, so anyone who does not want his military success should have recourse to this kind of force, because it is far more dangerous than a mercenary army. Auxiliaries are fatal. They constitute a united army, wholly obedient to the orders of someone else. But mercenaries, having conquered, need more time and opportunity to harm you, for they have not a compact force, and you have raised and paid them yourself. Mercenaries are also led by someone you appoint, and cannot immediately assume sufficient authority to do you harm. To sum up, cowardice is the danger with mercenaries, valor with auxiliaries. So the problem with bringing other nations' troops is they are valorous and unified. And he says, here we go, wise princes therefore have always shunned auxiliaries, and made use of their own forces. And this is great. They have preferred to lose battles with their own forces than to win with the use of others. It is the belief that no true victory is possible with alien arms. And then he gives a bunch of examples. But you can't win long term if you use somebody else's weapons to win for you. You didn't win, they won. And they know it. And he gives just more and more examples. Lots of Italian, lots of historical examples. And then we have a quote here, 47. I conclude, therefore, that unless it commands its own arms, no principality is secure. Rather, it depends on fortune, since there is no valor and no loyalty to defend it when adversity comes. Wise men have always held and believed, and then we have a Latin quote, quod nihil sit tam infernum at instabilquam fama potentiae non sua vinixia. And you're going to be like, of course, Professor, fluent in Latin, we all are. No. So if you're not, that's what notes are for, everybody. So, let's go to the notes. This is that, quote, this is on 103 if you're curious, that nothing is so weak or unstable as the reputation for power, which is not based on one's own forces. And this is a quote from Tacitus, who's a famous historian he's a Latin historian. All right, so now we know these are bad. So then we have to ask the question, how can a prince organize a militia? Right, so how do we make a good one if we know we need one? Well, let's get into that. So firstly, he points out here, a big part of this he points out is that the art of war is the primary skill of a prince. And this is what they should focus on exclusively. And he says, this is the first intro to 14. A prince, therefore, must have no other object or thought, nor acquire skill in anything except war, its organization, and its discipline. The art of war is all that is expected of a ruler, and it is so useful that besides enabling hereditary princes to maintain their rule, it frequently enables ordinary citizens to become rulers. On the other hand, we find that princes who have thought more of pleasures than of arms have lost states. The first way to lose your state is neglect the art of war. The first way to win a state is to be skilled at the art of war. And again, being Machiavelli, this is why I like him so much, he just keeps giving examples. He gives modern Italian examples for Francesco Forza, and he mentions here, and he says, quote, this is on 48, "You are bound to meet misfortune if you are unarmed, because other reasons people despise you, and this, as I shall say later on, is one of the infamies of a prince should be on his guard against. There is simply no comparison between a man who is armed and one who is not. It is unreasonable to expect that an armed man should obey one who is unarmed, or that an unarmed man should remain safe and secure when his servants are armed. In later case, there will be suspicion on the one hand and contempt on the other, making cooperation impossible. So a prince does not understand warfare, as well as other misfortunes he invites, cannot be respected by his soldiers or place any trust in them." So not only does a prince have to understand war, and a prince has to learn war, a prince has to be armed, and his people should be armed. And this is reiterating the point, right? The people despise an unarmed prince, and an unlearned prince in arms. And he gives an example too. He says, so he must never let his thoughts stray from military exercise, which he must pursue more vigorously in peace than in war. So prince has to always be practicing war. And then and then even basic stuff, and this will come back in Sun Tzu, it wouldn't shock you. You need to understand terrain, especially we're talking like early modern, late medieval princes. You're at least understand your terrain, right? Like if you're a prince with a kingdom, you grew up in it and it's yours, like, learn your area. Like how hard is that? Like spend all your time wargaming the geography. He literally talks about bring your officers and go play war games in your terrain and learn it. Again, think about this. This guy's paid to do this. This is his only job, right? If you're a prince, you are the state. The state pays you to learn this. If you're not doing this, you have no justification for your job. And by the way, just so you guys know, this is the real justification for aristocracy. A lot of modern thinkers will say oh, divine right of kings, blah, 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 blah. Nah, that's a much later appendage and is much more secondary to this, right? Where do kings and princes and queens and emperors get their right to rule? It's this. If they can fight and defend you, they earn the right to rule you, if that makes sense, right? Because you might think that sounds weird, but think about it. What's the number one thing that makes people leave their country? War and internal conflict. So if we don't have that, suddenly a place is safe and it's not so bad, right? Even if the prince is a bit oppressive, not getting stabbed all the time is better than getting stabbed. So this is the prince's job. All right. And then interestingly too, he mentions what a prince should also study. This is on 49. As for intellectual training, the prince must read history, studying the actions of eminent men, to see how they conducted themselves during war and discover the reasons for the victories and defeats, so that he can avoid the later and imitate the former. Above all, he must read history, so that he can do what eminent men have done before him, taken as their model some historical figure who has been praised and honored, and always keep his deeds and actions before him. And he gives a bunch of examples. Alexander the Great, and he copied Achilles. Caesar copied Alexander. Scipio copied Cyrus. And then anyone who lived the life of Cyrus written by Xenophon. We'll see how much the glory won by Scipio can be attributed to his emulation of Cyrus. And he mentions some of the traits, right? His chastity, his courtesy, his humanity, his generosity. And then finally he concludes, a wise prince must observe these rules. He must never take things easy in times of peace, but rather use the latter assiduously in order to be able to reap the profit of times of adversity. Then, when fortunes change, he will be ready to resist adversity. So there you go. You got to study. And never take it easy in peace. That's basically it. Yeah, again, these are good rules. I mean, it even makes sense in our time, like being a republic, right? If you have a government who's charging you to protect you, they should be practicing the thing they're doing. I mean, even in a completely apolitical way, right? Like nowadays, with let's just say things getting interesting in cities. There's a difference between a city that's relatively safe and a city that's pretty chaotic. And like when the government charges you a bunch of money to protect you from chaos, then they can't do it. You could argue they're losing their mandate. And here's the thing, they regardless of your politics, they lose their mandate. Does that make sense? Like, governments have their job, and if they can't do it, people won't respect it anymore. Regardless of type. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. Alright, any questions? This is a French guy, by the way. I think it's Louis the Ninth. We talk a lot about the French in this book, so I thought it was fitting. But if you have a question, I'll give it a couple seconds, and then we'll keep going. We're almost at the end of this, actually, which is crazy. Somebody said, would Aristotle agree that, quote, study history and great men? Yes, because Aristotle was an empiricist. What I mean is, Aristotle thought reality has answers, right? So, study great men. He's not a subjectivist, right? So, to be correct, how do you say it? To be successful requires doing things that lead towards good ends. So great men did, how can I say it? Think about it this way, right? If you study only men that fail, you'd learn how to fail. So if you study successful great men, you'd learn how to be great. That's it. If you believe objective reality exists, which Aristotle does, that is why one would do it. And again, if you ask, like, why does history generally focus on, great conflicts and great men and, trying times, it's the goal of history is to try to learn the lessons of those times. That's why you do it. That's a good question. Alright, looks like it's our only question. Cool, let's keep going. I think we might actually get as far as I wanted to get. Nope, wrong one. Here we go. Alright, so now we started getting the ethics. This is the fun part, and this is where Machiavelli gets a lot of flack, we'll say. So, section 15 is things for which men, especially princes, are praised and blamed. Now this we start to get into how this is the first line of it, and I'll get into it. It now remains for us to see how a prince must regulate his conduct towards his subjects or his allies. So we've kind of done, like, how does a prince defend himself, and, how can a prince take a place? But now it's how should a prince conduct himself versus his friends? And he knows it's written about a lot, and he's fine with that. And he's not trying to be original, but he says here, my intention is something that will be of practical use for the inquirer. And he says, I'm looking for their real truth, not their imagined truth. And many have dreamed up republics or principalities, which never in truth known to exist. And the gulf between how one should live and how one does live is so wide, that a man who neglects what is actually done for what should be done moves towards self-destruction rather than self-preservation. And the person who asked about Aristotle before, right? This is where Aristotle would agree. Aristotle was still an ethicist too, right? But he didn't think your ethics should be divorced from reality. And this is interesting too. Machiavelli is going to use a lot of very interesting words that kind of show that he actually does have an ethical system. He's just not an idealist. That's the difference. And he says here, quote, the fact that a man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. Therefore, if a prince wants to maintain his rule, he must be prepared not to be virtuous and to make use of this or not acting according to need. Again, when he's saying virtuous here, he's meaning like idealistically. And now we get a word that'll come back a lot, prudence. Now, if you're not a good catechized Catholic, you may have never heard this word before. So let me get my dictionary. There we go. Okay. Where's prudence? So as we talked about, I like definitions. So we're going to use older definitions because they tend to be slightly less politicized. So here we go. Prudence is a great word. The short version of prudence comes from Latin, prudentia, Wisdom applied to practice. And he gives there's a big long explanation here. Prudence implies caution in deliberating and consulting on the most suitable means to accomplish valuable purposes. Prudence differs from wisdom in that prudence implies more caution and reserve than wisdom, or is exercised more in foreseeing and avoiding evil than in devising and executing which is good. It is sometimes just caution or circumspection. But in this case, I think Machiavelli means this bit, right? So, acting with caution and reserve, trying to avoid evil. That's what we mean by prudence. And I bring this up because even though he says don't be virtuous, he says the word prudence a lot. So I want to bring that up. Because he says it here, where we have another quote here. Here's my PowerPoint. Yeah. He says, so Prince of Necessity has to be prudent so that he knows how to escape the evil reputation attached to those vices which could lose him a state, and how to avoid those vices which are not so dangerous if he possibly can. But if he cannot, he need not worry much about the latter. He says then here, quote, this is because taking everything into account, he will find that some of the things that appear to be virtues, if he practices them, ruin him, and some of the things that appear to be vices will bring him security and prosperity. And he mentions some of the vices and virtues here. Some are held to be benefactors, others called grasping, some cruel, some compassionate, one man faithless, another faithful, one man effeminate and cowardly, another fierce and courageous, one man courteous, another proud, one man lascivious, another man chaste, one guileless, another crafty, one stubborn, another flexible, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another skeptical, and so forth. So he gives you some ideas of what these virtues are. If you have trouble with any of these words, here is my recommended dictionary. It's Webster Dictionary, 1828. I actually have the hard copy in my room, too. It's great. It has all like the source words and stuff, which I'll use that as well. But for now, this is a nice, quick quotation. All right, let's keep going. So he gives us examples. The first one, generosity and parsimony. Now, if you're like, what the heck is parsimony? We're going to check it, because it's here. Where did I get that? The right or estate inherit... Oh, that's patrimony. Oh, yeah, my parsimony disappeared. Let's get it. Parsimony. Yeah, this is from parsis, saving, literally, close. Closeness or sparingness in the use of expenditure of money. Sometimes used perhaps in a good sense, implying due or justifiable caution in expenditure. So it could be cheapness or being reasonable with your money, and the generosity, obviously, spending it all, right? So this one, what's interesting here? He basically says, the shortest version is, if you're prince, do not get a reputation for being generous, because you have to give away so much money, you go broke. Or worse, where's this quote here? He says, this is at the bottom of 52. Again, someone might retort, there have been princes, after he warns that princes shouldn't be generous, there have been many princes who have won great success with their armies, who have been the reputation for being exceedingly generous. My reply to this is, princes give away what is own or his subjects, or else something belongs to others. In the first cause, he should be frugal, aka if he's giving away things that are his or his subjects, be frugal. But he should indulge, in the second, he should indulge his generosity in the full, aka if you're giving away someone else's stuff, be generous. Now, I'll explain what this means. He gives giving away what belongs to strangers in no way affects your standing at home. Rather, it increases it. You hurt yourself only when you give away what is your own. Now, when he says this, he's being very specific. Because on the general, you could say he's being immoral. But what he means is, for example, and he gives more details, but like if you're conquering somewhere as a prince, if you take everything, all your soldiers and people will be angry. And remember, if you're following his advice, all your soldiers are your people. So he's saying, when you invade somewhere, give to your troops and your people a lot. Why? Because you're taking from people who aren't your people and giving to your own people. And he's like, that is just a good political strategy. And if you look at the world, that's the number one, that's a mistake. That's the number one way that armies were funded until the modern age. Right? You take from the person you invade to pay your soldiers. Very common, and it's good Machiavelli. And it works, right? If the prince spends all his own money, you kind of destroy yourself. So in general, he's not a big fan of being generous. Let me see if there's anything else here. Nope, that's it for this one. All right, cruelty and compassion. So these are each binaries, right? And technically this is called Cruelty and Compassion, semicolon, and whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the reverse. Oh, and as normal, right, if you have any questions, I'm happy to stop. We had a couple, let's see. Somebody says, why is history so tough, or a great man lacking? Just kidding. Well, no, you could argue, most times there isn't great people. There isn't great men, great leaders. So one thing that kind of distinguishes history is both places that actually are lucky or blessed enough to have good leaders, but also places that make more than one great leader, right? That's rare. So a lot of countries' history, if you start to dig into them, you'll find like one period where they had one great leader who made a kingdom once, and then they collapsed for the rest of history. So that the challenge is, how do you make a society that continuously makes great men? And Machiavelli would say, you need to study great men. That would be his answer. My answer, I won't spoil it. That's what I'll say. By the end of the semester, hopefully you know my answer. That's my little leave it hanging. So Cruelty and Compassion. This one is where Machiavelli, a lot of people don't read Machiavelli, and they skip to this part. So he says, so a prince must not worry if he incurs reproach for his cruelty, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal. So Machiavelli, people say, it's so Machiavellian, you're cruel. He's like, no. You can be cruel as long as your own people are united and loyal. And then also, by making an example or two, he will prove more compassionate than those who, being too compassionate, allow disorder which leads to murder and rapine. So, again, Machiavelli is just pointing out, the job of a prince is to break some heads and kill some people to keep peace and not have murder and raping in your streets. I'm sure somebody can make a modern link to that. I'll just skip it. So, and then he goes from here, there arises the following question, this is on 54, whether it is better to be loved than feared or the reverse. The answer is one that would be both and one that is the other, but because it is difficult to combine them, it is far better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. So obviously every ruler wants to be loved and feared, but fear is better. And then he goes to explain about all of this, like heavily in depth. But the short version is something like, if you're feared, people will actually fight for you and die for you. But if you're loved, he says here, right, one can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. So while you treat them well, they are yours. But once you call them, if it's only love, they might not show up to fight. But if they fear you, they'll show up when it matters. So all of this is going back to your first premises of the book, right? How to make a state that can defend itself. That's what this book is focusing on. So it's better to be feared. And again, he says here, let me find this. But above all, the prince must abstain from the property of others, because men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. And this is where I had patrimony up, right? Here we go. The right or estate inherited from one's ancestors. So it's better to harm a member of a family than to take their stuff. And of course he says here too, abstain from the property of the subjects and the citizens and from their women. So he says, if you have to execute someone, do it only when there's a proper justification and manifest reason for it. So don't be arbitrary. So again, people give Machiavelli a bad rap, but he's like, no, sometimes you have to kill people, but do it for just reasons. He says, among the admirable achievements of Hannibal included this, that though he led a huge army, made up of countless different races, of foreign campaigns, there was never any dissension either among the troops themselves or against their leader. For this, his inhuman cruelty was wholly responsible. So Hannibal, if you don't know who Hannibal was, he's a famous Carthaginian general who invaded Italy and fought the Romans, and mostly won. He kept his army together through terror, not through love. But not too terrible, but terrible enough that he had good military discipline. And then he keeps giving good examples of being too soft. Now, then he goes into how princes are honor their word. And this one's interesting too, because again, if you read the spark notes of Machiavelli, or where people talk about Machiavelli, they tend to skip that he's not... He's more complicated than people who don't read him want to make him sound. So, for example, he says, everyone realizes how praiseworthy it is for a prince to honor his word and be straightforward, rather than crafty in his dealings. Nonetheless, contemporary experience shows that princes who have achieved great things are those who have been given their word lightly and have known how to trick men with their cunning, and who in the end have overcome the abiding only by honest principles. So he gives an example. You must understand, therefore, there are two ways of fighting, by law and by force. The first way is natural to men, that is law, and the second way is to beasts, which is war. And he mentions that a good prince must be both. So, and then he says, as a prince is forced to know how to act like a beast, he must learn from the fox and the lion. The lion, because it's defenseless against traps, and a fox is defenseless against wolves. Therefore, one must be a fox in order to recognize traps, and a lion to be fright off wolves. Those who simply act like lions are stupid. So it follows that a prudent ruler, prudence is back, remember that, cannot and must not honor his word when it places him at a disadvantage. And then when the reasons for which he made the promise no longer exist. So even keeping your word to like allies, you have to be reasonable about it. Like sometimes the reason you made that alliance is over and you shouldn't follow it. And he says, if all men were good, this precept would not be good. But because men are wretched creatures who would not keep their word to you, you need not keep your word to them. And no prince ever lacked good excuse to color his bad faith. And that's what Machiavelli gets famous for. And then right below this, there's another quote which is great. A prince, therefore, need not necessarily have all the good qualities I mentioned above, but he should certainly appear to have them. I would even go so far to say that if he has these qualities and always behaves accordingly, he will find them harmful. If he only appears to have them, they will render him service. So he points out, and he keeps going, this is on 57, the ruler should always appear to be compassionate, nice, and good. And then he mentions this too. To those seeing and hearing him, he should appear a man of compassion, a man of good faith, a man of integrity, a man of religious man. And there is nothing more important as to seem to have this last quality, aka being religious. And he says men generally require their eyes, not their hands. But again, it's always good to keep some leeway, basically. And then going in here, what's the limiting principle of this? Why can't you just always pretend to be good and be evil? Well, you need to avoid the hatred and contempt of men. And again, this involves everything, taking their stuff, etc. And he gives some advice here. I'm skipping a lot of this. You should read it yourself. Lots of good examples. But he says, well-organized states and wise princes have always taken great pains not to make the nobles despair, and to satisfy the people, and keep them content. This is one of the most important tasks for a prince to undertake. So what's the limiting principle to cruelty and not spending money? Well, you need to avoid the hatred of your people. Your nobles can't despair, and your people need to be satisfied. Otherwise, you will die or lose it. And again, you can look in history. Every time a noble has lost their kingdoms, this is the problem. And immediately under this is on 61. He talks about how France, that's why I have a Frenchman here, French do a pretty good job, right? They balance the nobles, and they balance the normal people and the king. It's all pretty decently balanced, and the people are pretty satisfied. And a stint from his time, right? That stays true for another 300 years. All right. Now, this one's cool, too. We'll get into some of the... It's not just pure negative. Oh, wait, there's one more thing for this one I want to read. Let's see... And he says, and there should be noted that one can be hated just as much for good deeds as evil ones. Therefore, as I said above, a prince who wants to maintain his rule is often forced not to be good, because whatever that class of men on which you believe your continued rule depends is corrupt, whether it be the populace, the soldiers, or the nobles. You have to satisfy it by adopting the same disposition, and then good deeds are your enemies. So if you're being held up by the soldiers, the people, or the nobility, and they're somewhat evil, you might have to emulate evil to stay in power. Oops. And why? To avoid being hated, basically. And is there any other cool quote here? Oh. And this is a point he makes too, under this section. Quote, here it should be noted that princes cannot escape death if an attempt is made by a fanatic. You can always be killed by someone fanatical. And this is why it goes back to harm. Don't harm your people. Harm as few people as possible. It mentions a Roman emperor who in the middle of his army got stabbed to death. Why? He killed one of his general's brothers, and you can't get away with it. Okay, is there another one? Nope, let's go to need of honor. Did I skip 21? I skipped 21, whether fortresses are useful or not. Generally, he says no. He mentions here, though, as soon as you disarm your subjects, you start to offend them by showing through cowardice or suspicion that you mistrust them, and on either score, hatred is aroused against you. Don't disarm your people. They know you don't trust them. He also mentions... where's this? He's mentioned about building castles and... generally, having division in your own nation is a cause that causes collapse. But he mentions that his ancestors used to think it was a good idea, and he's like, yeah, it's a dumb idea. And then 21, where we're here now, he mentions how a prince must act to win honor. So he gives examples. He mentions, this is great, going back to how we should study history, he says, quote, above all, in all his doings, a prince must endeavor to win the reputation of being a great man of outstanding ability. So a prince should always try to look like a great man to gain honor. He also mentions that no government should ever imagine that it can always adopt a safe course. Rather, it should regard all possible courses of action as risky. He talked about this in joining an alliance. You should never, in his view, avoid picking sides. You always have to pick sides. So he mentions here, so in the right above this, it is always the case that when one who is not your friend will request neutrality, and that one who is your friend will request your armed support. Princes who are irresolute usually follow the path of neutrality in order to escape immediate danger, and usually come to grief. It's always a trap. Neutrality is always a trap. And he says neighbors, right? It's not everywhere in the world. It's not what the United States does. But when your neighbors have a conflict, you have to choose a side or you'll lose. This is a big deal for both honor and how to choose conflicts. And you can basically never ignore conflict in his view. Finally, he gets into personal staff. This is really interesting. How are we doing on time? We're doing fine. He says the choosing of ministers is a matter of no little importance for a prince, and the worth depends on the sagacity of the prince himself. And then he says, the first opinion is formed of a ruler's intelligence based on the quality of men he has around him. People judge a ruler based on his men. And when they're competent and loyal, he's considered wise, but when they are otherwise, the prince is open to criticism. And then he mentions the kinds of intelligence. This is very interesting, too. The first kind of intelligence is understanding things for itself. So you can understand things by yourself. The second kind appreciates what others can understand. So even if you can't understand something, you can at least understand how others understand something. And finally, I love this, the third understands neither itself nor through others. So you at least, as a ruler, need to be able to understand through other people. But if you understand neither through others or yourself, you're the worst off. And then, of course, he talks about how flatterers should be shunned. This should be obvious, right? So don't just take yes man. That's what a flatterer is. But he mentions this. But he must, when it wants to, he must take advice when he wants to, but not when others want him to. Indeed, he must discourage everyone from tendering advice about anything unless it is asked for. So Prince can't be critiqued all the time. Machiavelli is not a free speech guy, right? He's like, when a prince asks for advice, he should get it, but not like when you don't ask for it. So you still got to control these, the personal staff giving you advice. Otherwise, you look weak, and you are weak, basically. All right, I'm stopping there. The last two chapters are like, how does Italy unify? And Machiavelli is famously an Italian nationalist. Like, he wants Italy to be unified. His last chapter is called Exhortation to Liberate Italy from the Barbarians. And it says, he mentions why he's so sad about Italy, quote, look at the duels and the combats between the few, how the Italians are spear in strength and skill, inventiveness. But when it's a matter of armies, they do not compare. This is all because of the weakness of their leaders. We were talking about great men earlier. So you could have strong men individually who are good at fighting, courageous, inventive. But if you lack leadership, you can spend 400 years being invaded by other people, which is actually what follows in Italy after this period. So leadership is critical. So, all right. And that's the Prince, folks. Any Prince questions before we start? Sun Tzu. We'll probably do 10 minutes of Sun Tzu. Or 5 minutes, probably. We'll at least start talking about him. Questions about the Prince. Parts that didn't make sense, or parts that I seem to go over too fast. Now is the time to distract me. Because worst case, we'll do Sun Tzu next class. I'm okay with that. If you guys have good questions. Sip of my tea. Looks like we're question free. Okay, we look good. Okay, so let's keep going then. Move the PowerPoint forward. Here we go. Okay, we had one question. Quote, how are we connecting the prince to the papers we will write? Well, as we go forward, we're going to use Sun Tzu and the prince as kind of methods to analyze what we're studying about. Does that make sense? Because I can't assume, and it's not fair of me to assume, you all have rigorous intellectual frameworks. How do you know? Well, when I was undergrad, we didn't have it either. Somebody says, quote, that's the answer. And we'll be much more explicit about it as we go into the history, the person who asked that. Somebody says, thinking of my poli-sci class, how would Machiavelli analyze subsistence communities? Well, the problem is, subsistence communities are by definition poor, right? So they don't really have the power to even really defend themselves, would be fair. Although I kind of think the modern, almost the modern pejorative of subsistence communities is a weird one, right? Because people will call anywhere that's kind of self-contained subsistent. Oh, you're not trading widgets to the world economy. You're a subsistence community. Right? The technical definition is people who make just enough to eat and pay their taxes, right? But, like, why don't we call somebody who lives in a city and has $300,000 of college debt and can barely afford to eat? Why don't we call that subsistence? You see the problem? So it would matter the kind of structure of the subsistence economy on how Machiavelli would judge it, because he's actually very pro on how they're ruled, what's their neighborhood, that kind of thing. Because, well, we'll get, as we go forward, I'm going to add a little bit more Machiavelli, specifically his discourses, his Republican work, the kind of mirror of the prince. In that, he's quoted as saying, I would take like goat herders over a city, because goat herders are more virtuous. So for him, virtue and, like, the quality of the people actually matters. So, in a way, he'd more ask, like, what kind of people are in those subsistence communities? Because Machiavelli still is an ethical guy when it comes to the base of his thinking. So, the richness of the community wouldn't be his question, it'd be the quality. Because he'd still be like, okay, but even if they're subsistence, what if they're made of good, like, fiber, right? They're good people. They would, and they care about the community. They might fight better than people from a big, rich city. Which, again, Machiavelli's living in a time when people in big, rich cities literally can't fight. Somebody says, quote, would you say that people mirror the quality of those ruling them? That's a tricky one. I would say probably something like the quality of the people matter more in a republic than a principality, if you ask Machiavelli, right? Because a prince, this is almost Confucian, but a prince can kind of mandate the quality to his people, but if they're very evil, he has to, like Machiavelli just mentioned, we read, you have to kind of emulate your supporters, even if they're bad people, just so they like you. But a prince does have more influence to change the people, but a republic can never be better than the people. And that's Machiavelli's perspective, not even mine. Machiavelli would always say any kind of representative government, right, not a pure principality, requires quality people. So, but even in The Prince, right, he points out that you need the people on your side, and it implies quality of the people matters. But it's more indirect, but the only reason I know that I've read other books. So Machiavelli does think quality matters. I'm glad I can answer that. Somebody asked about what formats of No Sweat prefer. Legible. That's my answer. As long as it indicates your understanding of the reading material, I like your notes. If it's bullet points, more correctly, right, like, you can write full paragraph notes if you want, but most humans write bullet point notes, don't they? Right? Like, even if you're like me and you got the stack of 3x5 cards here, right? Like, why wouldn't you use bullet points? Because you can just refer to the page number for the full. Probably the only full notes I take whenever I'm doing random reading, I have a notebook where I do just questions that would make interesting articles. Those I tend to write in question form, but they're still kind of like bullet points. So, as long as they're legible and demonstrate your understanding, I don't care. All right. We've only got like 4 minutes, so I'm going to talk about the structure of the Art of War before you read it, and then we'll be free. Yeah, thank you for the good question. And one thing I love in the recent memory, the number of Chinese, ancient China themed games has been increasing in the West. There used to only really be Japanese games, which is funny. But now we're getting some Western games, so we're getting actually better Chinese-themed art, which is super cool for my PowerPoints. I'm not going to complain. So, okay, because we're almost out of time, folks, we're going to finish the Art of War. Now, if you're going to like, oh my god, Professor Zeiser, how are we going to finish it? Literally, it starts on page 4, ends on page 94. Now, that sounds hard. It's in literally poetry form. Somebody mentioned something called The Black Myth of Wukong is coming out. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look it up. But yeah, it's cool. So there's good art. Now, when you're reading this, I hope you got this edition. Now, there's some negative parts of this edition. For example, the introduction is really weird. Like, the translator takes Sun Tzu, and generally people think like, oh yeah, you can apply Sun Tzu to your life, and business, and to war. Somebody says it's like a Souls game. I may or may not really like Dark Souls. Dark Souls is pretty cool. It might be one of the only Japanese games I really like. No, I like Dark Souls. I like Romance of Three Kingdoms. The Dynasty Warriors games were fun back in the day. I don't really like most Japanese games, though, which is weird because I like Japan a lot. All right, so real quick, we're almost out of time. So before we go, a quick reading note on the book. The version I wanted you guys to buy. The introduction's weird because he makes it sexual, which means he's a modernist. It's weird. But this book has the book, and then if you flip back to page... What page is this? I have a note in it. 100. From page 99, you then have the commentaries. There's exegesis. So, and if you don't know what exegesis means, we're going to learn new words today. Exegesis is expedition, explanation, interpretation, a discourse intended to explain or illustrate the subject. You have 2,000 years of Chinese exegesis here. You also have the translator. I don't really like his, but you also have Wade Giles, who's one of the most famous Chinese translators in all of history for the West. So as you read the book, for the parts that don't make obvious sense, we're going to read the book, but we're also going to look at the exegesis in the back. So the back of this edition is full of the traditional Chinese analysis, which is super cool. It gives us lots of content on like how have the Chinese studied the art of war throughout history. So this is what we're going to get into starting next week. Next class on Wednesday. So if you want to know more about Sun Tzu, please come Wednesday. If you're a random person and not in my class, you want to know which version we're using the Penguin Classics translation. Let me see. It's John Milford's translation. Good translation. He's still a weird dude. It's a 2019 version. And that's it. All right. So I'm going to end the stream here, and class is officially over. I think I have a couple more questions. No, I'll answer. No, there's not. We're fine. I'll answer the rest in the chat. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all Wednesday. All right, take it easy.